I've had a few clear nights, and I've collected lots of data, and I've got some experience of what it's like to guide through narrowband filters using a duo camera. Now, first off, I'm going to tell you my results at the beginning of the video because I hate these channels that put it all the way at the end and make you watch the whole video. It works. It works every single way that I've pretty much tried it. And I was not expecting that, okay? I was expecting this thing to actually fail in a lot of different scenarios, but it works, okay? And let this be a lesson, you know, don't listen to the keyboard warriors out there who have no experience with something. Everybody online has been saying that the Duo isn't going to work through narrowband filters, but basically my tests show that it in fact definitely does, and it works really good. So first, let me give you a little bit of background, some of the parameters of my tests and where I come from, okay? Typically, with this mount and this telescope and so forth, I typically get an RMS of about 0.5. And also, I typically, on really good nights, I get an RMS of 0.2. And by the way, I've actually been seeing a lot of that with this camera. So that's kind of what I expect from my AM5, and this is the mount that I've tested it with. I will of course test it with an iOptron here soon, but something else, my polar alignment, basically for all of these tests, I got the polar alignment within the teens of seconds, okay? So in other words, about 18 seconds or less, and one night I actually had 0, so which I typically don't get it that good, but anyways, I did for that test. Now in this first round of tests, the scope that I used was my SV Bunny 122mm Apple triplet, and I am using a 1.8x focal reducer, which does reduce the image circle size. And the corrected field of view of this scope is pretty big. At the edges of a 35mm sensor, it's still pretty good. It's a little bit off. The stars are just a touch soft, but overall the performance is pretty good. And this is of course an f5.6 scope when reduced, an f7 scope when it's in its regular use. Now, a little bit of information about my guide camera and how I set it up. Of course, the guide camera is integrated into this camera, but from the factory, the focus was fine. I basically didn't touch it at all. It is just a touch out of focus, and that is actually how I like to keep it. In fact, I've had like a couple people comment on the color Duo version of this camera and say that they had trouble with their guiding. And in every single situation, I told them, guess what? Set your guide camera just slightly out of focus. And every single one of them has reported back to me that this in fact fixed their problem. So you will get superior guiding if you set your guide camera slightly out of focus. That's a scientific fact. You can go ahead and try it yourself either way. All right, for some reason there is, I guess, once again, the keyboard warriors out there who are telling everybody that you need to have perfect focus for your guide camera. And no, you do not. It needs to actually be just slightly out of focus. And that's how I did my test. Also, I used a darks library, which every single one of you should be building a darks library and using that, because that will reduce noise and will improve the signal, and also of course improve the shape and look of your star to the algorithm. And so you will get superior guiding results that way. And then one last thing, I was using a gain of 350, which actually just kind of seems to be the gain that works really good with this particular camera, the IMX220. All right, let's show you the results over here. And you can go ahead and zoom in and everything and look at the numbers in detail. But basically, they're actually pretty impressive considering we are shooting through narrowband filters. Now, for all of these tests, I pointed this scope to the darkest, most starless section of sky that I had available for me right now, which I think meant stars below 14th or 13th magnitude, something like that. Very, very, very faint, okay? My star chart had no stars in this section. And that's what I torture test this thing with. I don't think any of you will be pointing to any part of the sky that is darker than what I was pointing at, all right? You are almost guaranteed to have more stars than what I was working with. But anyways, the results were quite good. And actually, like a couple things that I want to point out, if you look at the results, there really wasn't a difference between wide narrowband filters and the narrowest filters that I used. For example, the luminous, or the first filter that I used, was actually a dual narrowband filter, which has 2 band passes, but they're combined to be about 13.5 nanometers. And if you look at their results compared to the 5nm results, there really isn't a big difference. So if you're wondering how is this going to perform with an even narrower filter than 5nm, let's say you got a 3.5nm filter or a 4nm filter, I think you really don't have anything to worry about. Which brings up something else here. So the last test that I did, which I only did with the 5nm filters, because they're the harder test obviously with this telescope and this setup, was I stopped the aperture down to this little guy right here. This is an f10 stop down mask. So basically I reduced this scope to f10. F freaking 10, guys. Okay, that's really, really slow. I don't think any of you are going to be using a scope slower than that. The only scopes I think that would be probably like that slow would be maybe an RC, which even that wouldn't quite be that slow because usually those are f8. Although if you calculate in the central obstruction, they're kind of like f9 something. But still, you know, it's like I was able to get this thing to work at f10, you know, and it worked quite well actually. You know, it played solve just fine in f10 through my narrowband filters, and it guided pretty good. There was actually only one situation where I could not get it to work, and that was using very, very short half-second exposures. And let's talk a little bit about exposure length. So with any configuration that you have, with any kind of gear that you have, you need to just experiment with different shutter speeds, okay? Once again, the keyboard warriors are out there telling people they need to use the shortest possible exposure in order to get the best guiding. No, you don't. What you need to do is let your mount and your gear tell you what is the best exposure length. And in the past, typically 1 to 2 seconds has been the best and the norm for this, okay, before I had this camera. And with this camera, guess what? Once again, nothing's really changed. 1 to 2 seconds seems to be the best shutter speed that this particular scope likes. I think if I had an AM5N, which has even less periodic error, that their mount actually would probably like an even longer exposure, maybe a 4-second exposure, because it has less periodic error than this one does. But you know, periodic error is kind of one of the biggest things that will like influence as to how long of exposure you can use. You know, but yeah, hey, those are my results. I was actually pretty pleased with them. Again, I was not expecting this thing to perform as well as it has, but it did. In conclusion, those were my test results. I am going to actually continue doing other things. I have another couple of scopes that I'm going to try this with. I'm going to try it with a different type of mount as well. And I expect good results, of course, overall, now that I've actually kind of had a taste with this particular camera. I know this scope has a very good size image circle. I think those of you, the only ones of you I think that will really need to worry about this will be if you have a telescope that has an image circle that is too small for a 35mm sensor. And I'm going to stress once again that you cannot trust the manufacturers to tell you the image circle size of your telescope, because they will tell you the corrected image circle size. Corrected image circle size is a number that's very easy to make large. And from a marketing standpoint, that sounds great. However, to have an illuminated image circle, okay, that is a little bit more difficult. This one has a pretty big one, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I tested this one first. And now the other scopes that I have pretty good image circle sizes, and I know with the Duo that I have that's color, I really haven't any trouble with it. I'm not expecting any difficulties, we'll see. But yeah, I'm going to, in my channel, be showing more tests with more scopes and so forth. And that kind of concludes my video. Again, stay away from the keyboard warriors that are out there. They really are dangerous. This camera, what is awesome about it is that it really does make astrophotography easier. There's fewer things to hook up, there's fewer things to get wrong. It's just, overall, this thing is an easier to use camera than any other configuration that I have, and I've used off-axis guiders before. I have one. I shelved it, okay, because it was just too difficult. This is easy, okay. This is a piece of cake compared to an off-axis guider. Same thing with using a guide scope. Okay, I've used many guide scopes, and I've experimented with many different things to kind of try to tune them and get them to work as fantastic as I can. And in every single scenario, this guy and also my color version of the Duo, they just beat them in every single respect when it comes to guiding. I get better guiding using a duo than I do either an off-axis guider or a guide scope. All right, so that kind of sums up this video. I will be doing a review of this scope, or actually on the scope, the camera. And in that, I will actually show pictures because I have been collecting a bunch of pictures, and I'm going to process them and kind of show you really how great a camera this is.